On a dark winter night, the ruthless face of war was once again preparing to take center stage. Under the brave leadership of Osman Pasha, the Ottoman forces began to move stealthily to break the siege and make one last effort to survive, piercing through enemy lines. The air was cold, pitch dark, and silent. However, the inner fire of courage shone in the soldiers' eyes. It was only a matter of time before the numerically superior Russian army noticed this bold maneuver. The hopes of the Ottoman soldiers to break through the enemy's fortress and reach their freedom were burning with each passing moment. At the peak of the defense of Plevna, the thin line between heroism and despair reveals the story of a legendary resistance. In the intense atmosphere of war, this tale, where dramatic moments and heroic epics intertwine, deeply explores the turning points of the battle and the epic moments experienced by the soldiers. By 1877, the ongoing tension between the Ottoman Empire and Russia had reached a point of no return. These two great powers had long been engaged in a fierce struggle to expand their influence in the Balkans. Russia aimed to free the Orthodox Slavic peoples from Ottoman rule through its Pan-Slavism policy and bring them under its influence. The Ottoman Empire, already weakened, was forced to go to war to preserve its authority and territorial integrity. The uprisings of the Slavic peoples in the Balkans against the Ottomans, along with Russia's support for these uprisings, directly dragged the two empires into conflict. Russia's ambitions were not limited to the Balkans. It also sought to gain control over Istanbul and the Straits. For this reason, the Ottoman-Russian War of 1877 to 1878, also known as the 93 War, was of great strategic importance for both empires. In the midst of this great war, a small town named Plevna became a battleground that would determine the fate of the conflict. Located south of the Danube River, at the foothills of the Balkan Mountains, this town stood out as one of the region's most important defensive points. Control of Plevna was vital for the Ottoman Empire, as it was the last line of defense capable of halting the Russian advance in the Balkans. The Russians aimed to capture Plevna to break the Ottoman resistance in the Balkans and open the way to Istanbul. Therefore, the attack on Plevna was seen not merely as the capture of a town, but as a strategic move that would determine the fate of two great empires. The Ottoman Empire assigned one of its most trusted commanders, Gazi Osman Pasha, to defend this critical point. Osman Pasha was a prominent figure known for his military abilities and leadership qualities. With his 40,000 soldiers, he took on the responsibility of defending Plevna against the massive Russian army, which consisted of 120,000 troops equipped with modern artillery units. As the Russians prepared to besiege Plevna, the fate of the war would be written in the valleys nestled between the mountains of this small town. Plevna was highly advantageous for defense due to its natural geographical location. Surrounded by mountains and rivers, this town provided strategic advantages for the defending forces. Osman Pasha made use of this advantage by constructing a series of fortifications around the town. Trenches, ditches, and artillery positions were carefully placed. The Ottoman defense tactics against the Russians' modern weaponry were built upon patient and disciplined resistance. Osman Pasha not only strengthened his soldiers on the battlefield, but also boosted their morale. He ensured that each soldier was aware they were participating in a battle that would determine the fate of the Ottoman Empire. This war was not just a military conflict. It was a fight for survival for the future of two civilizations. Russia was aware that if it captured Plevna, it could advance all the way to Istanbul. The Ottomans, on the other hand, faced the risk of completely losing their presence in the Balkans if they lost this critical line of defense. When the Russians began their first major assault on Plevna on July 20th, 1877, they were unaware of how fierce the battle would be. Russian commanders believed they could easily break through the Ottoman defenses, relying on their numerical superiority. However, the soldiers under Gazi Osman Pasha were ready to demonstrate extraordinary resistance against these attacks. The Ottoman lines, protected by cleverly placed fortifications, deep trenches, and ditches, stood like a steel wall. The hours-long bombardment from the Russian artillery only created clouds of dust instead of destroying the Ottoman positions. And the soldiers huddled in the trenches waited silently under the deadly rain. When the fire ceased, Russian infantry began to advance in wide lines. However, this was the moment they would first confront Plevna's tough defenses. As the Ottoman soldiers rose from their trenches and aimed their rifles at the enemy, a deadly counterattack began. The Russian troops entering the fire zone were shaken by a sudden hail of bullets. Behind each trench, a fight for survival was taking place. Osman Pasha's soldiers did not abandon their positions. With every step, they showed even fiercer resistance. Retreat was not an option. Every soldier here was aware that they were guarding the last line of defense for the Ottomans. The Russians charged the Ottoman trenches repeatedly, but were forced to withdraw each time, suffering heavy casualties. Plevna was beginning to write a tale of defense. In August, the Russians returned with a larger force this time. With the support of their Romanian allies, this attack was executed with far greater power and determination than previous attempts. More than 100,000 soldiers gathered around Plevna were using all kinds of heavy weapons to breach the Ottoman lines. Starting with the first light of dawn, the artillery fire aimed to pummel the Ottoman trenches throughout the day. The sounds of cannon fire echoed down the mountains into the valleys, shaking the ground with every bullet that exploded in the Ottoman positions. However, the soldiers under Osman Pasha's command, undeterred by this horrific noise, disciplined themselves and held their positions. For them, it meant either victory or death. When the infantry was pushed to the front lines, Russian and Romanian soldiers surged forward in waves against the Ottoman trenches. Advancing through blood and mud, the soldiers had to step over the bodies of their dead or wounded comrades with every step. Corpses piled up in front of the Ottoman trenches, and the soil of Plevna was now soaked in blood. Amidst this chaos and horror, the Ottoman soldiers dropped their rifles and grabbed their bayonets. In fierce hand-to-hand combat on the Plevna trenches, swords and bayonets clashed. Soldiers from both sides struggled in the trenches, fighting for survival. The Russians were unable to break the Ottoman defenses. When they reached the trenches, the Ottoman soldiers stubbornly refused to retreat, heroically defending every inch of land. During this time, Osman Pasha personally visited the front line to boost his soldiers' morale and manage his commands more closely. Behind each trench, soldiers with bloodshot eyes fought even more bravely under the Pasha's supervision. The Russian numerical superiority was undeniable, but the Ottoman soldiers refused to allow their resistance to break. Amidst the sounds of cannon fire, the clash of bayonets, and the cries of soldiers, a tale of human endurance was being written in Plevna. After hours of fighting, the Russian and Romanian forces were once again forced to retreat. In their withdrawal, they left behind thousands of dead and wounded. The area around Plevna had now turned into a battlefield cemetery, but Osman Pasha and his soldiers still stood tall. Plevna had not fallen once again. But this was a victory far from winning the war. Both sides had suffered great losses, but the Ottoman soldiers managed to hold their ground despite all the challenges. By September, the battle in Plevna had reached a turning point. Russian commanders, having failed to breach the Ottoman defenses in their previous assaults, decided to formulate a new strategy. Instead of defeating Osman Pasha and his army with a direct attack, they intended to completely besiege Plevna, forcing it to surrender. Isolating the city from the outside world meant that no aid could reach it. The Ottoman garrison was trapped around Plevna, food supplies were dwindling, and ammunition shortages began to appear. Hunger had become the greatest enemy for both the civilians and the soldiers inside the city. This siege marked perhaps the most brutal phase of the war. The Russians cut off all supply routes to Plevna. The increasingly harsh conditions within the city gradually began to erode the morale of the Ottoman soldiers. Hunger weakened not just their bodies, but also their spirits. Soldiers were finding less food each day, trying to fill their stomachs with whatever remnants remained from their dwindling rations. Malnutrition and diseases within the city further weakened the defense. Despite Osman Pasha's determination, the weariness and hopelessness in his soldiers' eyes were becoming an undeniable reality. The mud, cold, and hunger surrounding the fortress were not only signs of a physical siege, but also of a psychological collapse. By December, the situation had become unbearable. Recognizing that the city's defense could no longer be sustained, Osman Pasha decided to make one last effort. He devised a plan to break the siege and breach the enemy lines to escape. This would be a daring and deadly endeavor. The Ottoman soldiers gathered to fight with one last hope, having saved their last fragments of energy for this operation. On a dark December night, as the cold winds of Plevna howled between the trenches, Osman Pasha's final order spread silently. The Ottoman soldiers prepared for perhaps the most significant operation of their lives. The moonlight was dim, and the sky was overcast. This was their only advantage. Swords were gripped tightly, rifles were shouldered. Every step was as heavy as feet sinking into mud. Exhausted bodies, worn down by hunger, had not lost their fighting spirit. Led by Osman Pasha, this small unit advanced along the fine line between life and death. As the silent Ottoman forces approached the enemy lines, the tension in the air felt as sharp as a knife. This was their last chance. Each soldier fixed his eyes on the darkness ahead, waiting for the storm to break. However, on that dark night, the Russians were alert and ready. When the Ottoman soldiers emerged from their trenches to launch their attack, the enemy army suddenly appeared from the shadows. The Russians were not only numerically superior, but also prepared. The sound of cannon fire pierced the night, and flames from rifles suddenly illuminated the battlefield. The Ottoman forces desperately tried to advance under this hail of fire, but with every step, more soldiers fell to the ground. As hand-to-hand combat began, Osman Pasha's men fought heroically, bayonets gleaming, swords clashing. Yet, the Russian line stood firm like a wall. Every Ottoman soldier fought to the last breath, refusing to surrender until the very end. When the order to retreat was given, the courageous struggle that blended into the night had turned into a defeat. Despite all their courage, the Ottoman soldiers were pushed back in the face of the Russian counterattack. The numerical superiority and the advantages of the siege shattered Osman Pasha's last hope. As they retreated, the Ottoman forces were now exhausted both physically and mentally. The defense of Plevna was coming to an end. Every trench, every fortress wall signified the dramatic conclusion. The fatigue, gloom, and hopelessness in their eyes were signs that the resistance in Plevna had finally come to an end. Although Osman Pasha and his soldiers tried to stand tall with one last effort, they knew that the outcome of this battle was now inevitable. December 10th, 1877, became a day of profound significance for the Ottoman army. Ghazi Osman Pasha had faced every hardship over the 3 months since the siege began, striving to defend Plevna with the determination of his soldiers. However, the fatigue and hunger brought on by the war had reached their breaking point. The city's defensive lines were cracking, and the Russian army not only had numerical superiority, but also left behind a scarcity of food and ammunition that pushed the Ottomans to the brink of exhaustion. With each passing day, the morale of the troops waned further, and the situation on the battlefield deteriorated. Osman Pasha was forced to make a difficult decision. During meetings, as the state of his soldiers' losses and the lack of ammunition were discussed, every expression was filled with uncertainty about the future. As a leader, Pasha observed not only the physical condition of his soldiers, but also their morale. He feared that surrender would be seen as a defeat. However, he knew that this heroic army, which had become a symbol of solidarity and resistance throughout the siege, needed to save their lives before incurring further losses. Ultimately, he had to accept that their endurance against the enemy's firepower had been exhausted, and that overcoming the enemy's numerical superiority was no longer possible. When Osman Pasha communicated the decision to surrender to the Russian commanders, he tried to suppress the complex emotions within him. Although there was determination in his eyes, sorrow filled his heart. His soldiers had risked everything for their homeland, pushing every limit to survive. Yet, in the end, they found themselves besieged in Plevna. The decision to surrender was not an end to their courage, but a fight to preserve their lives. Ghazi Osman Pasha had to think of his soldiers' lives when making this decision. It was one of the most difficult moments for a leader. When the Russians learned that the surrender notification had reached them, they began to cheer in victory. The fall of the city heightened the enemy's hopes and opened the road to Istanbul. However, Osman Pasha and his soldiers had inscribed their names in the annals of military history with the courage and resistance they exhibited during the siege. Plevna would be remembered not just as a city, but as a symbol of a nation's honorable resistance. Although this victory was a significant gain for the Russian army, the heroism displayed by the Ottoman soldiers would inspire not only their people, but the entire world. The fall of Plevna would be remembered as the last major resistance of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans, and the memories of this resistance would live on forever. While surrender might be perceived as an end, the struggle they left behind would continue to keep the spirit of honor and warfare alive. Ghazi Osman Pasha and his soldiers may have lost, but they had written an unforgettable saga. The Battle of Plevna was a story of relentless resistance that left a mark on history. Soldiers on both sides entered a struggle beyond the ordinary, fighting through challenging terrains and harsh weather conditions. At every moment of the war, they risked their lives to take one more step, defend one more position, or capture another stronghold. In this bloody conflict, the soldiers displayed endurance that went beyond human limits. Under hunger, thirst, severe injuries, and relentless artillery fire, the days spent in the trenches seemed to stretch on like months. As each day connected to the next, even the survivors watched as they lost their friends and commanders, one by one. The cold face of war grew more evident in Plevna with each passing day. In this grueling struggle within the trenches, the soldiers' resilience was extraordinary. Day and night, as the heavy sounds of artillery and explosions echoed, Plevna's dusty terrain was filled with fearless warriors. Standing on the thin line between life and death, the soldiers on both sides continued to fight with remarkable determination. In this battle, it wasn't just the power of weapons and bombs that was challenging. The harsh winter conditions of Plevna, freezing cold, thirst, and hunger were equally grueling. At times, these natural conditions were as merciless as the enemy's bullets, testing the strength of the soldiers. Every drop of blood spilled in Plevna remained as a testament to this fierce struggle. In the end, what remained of this bloody and epic struggle was only destruction and unforgettable memories of history. If you too have taken a journey into the details of this arduous battle, don't forget to like our video, share your thoughts in the comments, and support us by subscribing to our channel. See you in our next documentary.